Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. These microphones, I've got two of them today. Normally I'm used to having none, so I'm doubling down on microphones. So one of the first questions I like to ask people, just so I understand a little bit about the people I'm speaking with, is how many of you are farmers? And how many are gardeners? Whoa, all right. That's great. How many are other? Okay, a couple other, all right. Underutilized category in my opinion. Here is let's see how this works. This is the agenda I had for today, and when I was asked how long or what kind of a talk, I thought that 4 hours was enough time for just about everybody in the room to be completely sick of me by the end of the 4 hours. But what's important about 4 hours is that if we're going to have a conversation about low-cost, no-cost mineral amendments, we really all have to have a common understanding about the relationship between plants and the soil. And so the first portion of this program, the first couple of hours, I'm going to talk about some of the more current science about soils and plants. And some of this stuff is really, really amazing. It's mind-bendingly amazing. And it's fairly technical, and I'm going to do my best to explain it in language that I'm going to say a normal person can understand, because it gets thick and deep there a little bit. But once we understand the complexities of the relationship between soil and plants, then we can begin to understand how these mineral amendments, with all of these minerals in them of proportions, plant proportions, actually will facilitate the environment that they're going to be applied to. And that's not just the plant, but it's also the soil as well. And the underlying message that I have for you today goes something along the lines of all things require plant energy. Any intervention that we induce or incur in an agricultural environment is going to require plant energy in order to bring things into balance, to digest whatever we put on the soil. Whatever we do requires plant energy. And so we need to think about what we're putting on our plants in that light. It's not only what is this going to do to help the plant, but it's also how much energy is the plant going to have to expend in order to make what we're putting on the plant into a usable form that the plant can then utilize. Actually, we could stop right there and everything would be fine if that's okay with you guys. So I'm going to talk in the beginning, I'm going to talk about the nature of nature. I'm going to talk about the minerals that William Albrecht suggests we might want. I'm going to talk about organic matter, and I'm going to talk about soil biology. And we'll go through these things. And what I like to do in these conversations is pause for a bit, because I'm going to throw an awful lot your way. And we'll stop for a minute and be able to ask a couple of questions. And hopefully that will level set, everybody gets up to speed, a little bit comfortable with what's going on before we move on to the next subjects, which will be actually considering the voltage and the acidity in our soil. A lot of us think about acidity, and we talk about acidity and how important acidity is, and some of us might not think it's that important, but what really is important is the combination of soil and voltage and acidity. And so I'm going to introduce to you, if you haven't heard it already, the concept of voltage and the importance of voltage. By the way, we're all electric. We all have voltage flowing through us. And so this shouldn't come as a surprise, but it might be a little bit different language than you're used to. Okay, that's going to get real heavy duty, and we're going to get thick and deep, and you're going to roll your eyeballs and all the rest of that. And then we're going to take a break. And we'll stop for a minute and calm down and take it easy a little bit. And then we're going to get to some fun stuff. And we're going to actually Jaden is going to show us how he made some of these mineral amendments. and how simple it is and how functional they are based on the conversation that we had earlier. And then we'll go a little bit further and we'll talk about how we can use this new toolbox of mineral amendments to facilitate different phases of development of our plants. That's pretty cool. And then that's going to give us a real good idea of conversations about regenerative and sustainable. And I'm going to finish off with a scorecard about regenerative and sustainable concepts. And what I'm going to tell you is that they're not buzzwords. Now, I know that a lot of people use them as buzzwords, but I'm going to give you the ideas of a scorecard that you can use yourself to evaluate your own practices that will not only give you an idea of how regenerative and sustainable you might be, but also give you the notion of what it is that you might not understand. The one thing that is common about agricultural conversations is how quickly we come to the point in a conversation where we say, I don't know, right? And so recognizing we don't know and using that information or those gaps, if you want to call it, to go and learn more is really important. So that's what I had in mind. We good? All right, let's give it a shot. Wrong way. So before I start, I like to acknowledge some of the people whose shoulders I stand on. A lot of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting to you today are not my ideas. And I've been able to corral these ideas into the conversation we're going to have. But how many people have heard of John Kemp, for instance? Okay, a few of you. John is a well-known speaker, and I would consider one of the leading voices in these conversations. How about Korean natural farming? Master Cho. A couple of you? Okay. In Asia, they've been growing food on the same land for 3,000 or 4,000 years. Catch that, 3,000 or 4,000. Now, we in this country, we've managed to just about destroy the soil in what, 100 years? 3,000, 4,000 years. How do they do that? How did they do that? And so those are some of the concepts that we're going to be introducing today. And then there's Jadam, who is actual Master Cho's son. By the way, Master Cho died a couple of months ago, for those of you who might be interested in that. And then Jadam is another extension of those ideas. And we'll be touching on some of that. Are we going to touch on that? I don't think we are. And then there's Don Huber. How many familiar with Don Huber? Another seminal voice in the agricultural world. And his work in agronomy is unsurpassed, in my opinion. And then we're going to touch on the work of Gerald Pollack in the fourth phase of water. Anybody? Okay. This is absolutely revolutionary kind of discussion about a fourth phase of water. And we're going to use, and I'm going to introduce this concept of the fourth phase of water specifically so that we can understand how minerals and biology, fungi actually flow through plants. Fantastic stuff. And we're also going to touch on the work of Olivier Husson. Anybody? Okay. Olivier Husson has brought to light the concept and the importance of both the redox potential, which is a word that no normal person should understand, but essentially it's voltage. And the relationship between voltage and acidity defining all life. And we're going to use this, and it's going to be a relatively complex conversation, but we're going to be able to use this to understand how pests, insects, pathogens, affect plants and why they affect plants. And we're going to be using it to try and understand this energy conversation that I just mentioned earlier. The plant energy required in order to combat pests. Okay, we're going to be right on the deep end right there, right? But you're going to be able to handle it. It's going to be okay. We're going to be able to get through this. And then finally, the work of James White. James White, anybody? Yep. So James White has done work to identify what's called the microphagy cycle, and he is introducing the idea that bacteria actually exists within the seeds of a plant and actually exists within the plant itself, and we'll touch upon that. And the idea of all this is to let you understand how complex the system is, how important plant energy is, and the importance of conserving plant energy as we grow our tomatoes. All right? All right. Fasten your seatbelts. The first thing I want to talk about is the nature of nature. And plants have been around for 400 million years. That's a long time. Now, in order to survive on Earth for 400 million years, you have to have some very, very robust strategies for dealing with all these interventions that take place. And there are a whole bunch of different kinds of interventions. At first, there's the natural interventions. These are the volcanoes, the earthquakes, the tectonic movement of the Earth, asteroids hitting the planet, and all the stuff that takes place in 400 million years. And plants have somehow figured out how to navigate all of that. And we're going to talk about that and how they actually do that. But they've also, in the last couple of thousand years, have to navigate the interventions of us, of human beings. Tilling, removing the whole plant from the ground, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. How about the effect of 5G? How about the 10,000 satellites that are bombarding us with electromagnetic radiation? What does that do to plants? So the point is that plants have to figure out how to deal with all of that stuff. It's no easy business being a plant. You can't get up and leave. You can't go inside the house, right? You got to figure it out somehow. And plants have done that. The other thing that's amazing about plants is they're responsible for the oxygen we breathe, right? We have our environment because of plants providing oxygen. The food we eat is because of plants. The soil that we plant in is because of plants. The fossil fuels that we burn are because of plants. So plants deserve an amazing amount of respect, in my opinion, that may not necessarily be coming their way on such a regular basis when you consider how much we destroy plant environment. But the point is that anything we do to the system, whether it's burning up topsoil, whether it's whatever we do, applying pesticides, whatever it is, it's the plant energy that's required to bring that system back into balance. There's nothing else. There's no other form of energy out there that's going to bring things into balance. So this is an example of our recognition that by doing the things we do, we are spending plant energy. All right? The other concept I want to make clear or understood is the idea of gradients. Is anybody familiar with that word, gradients? Okay, a gradient is a change. And some of the gradients that are familiar with is temperature, for instance. The sun comes up in the morning and everything gets warm. And things get warmer and warmer. And that is a gradient. That is a temperature gradient. The sun is warming things up and things get warm. The sun goes down and then it cools off. That is a temperature gradient cooling down. Well, there's pressure gradients as well. You get a high pressure system that comes through or a low pressure system that comes through. Those are pressure gradients that take place. Well, there's also concentration gradients. When I go and put 10-10-10 on my field or something like that, all of a sudden I have a high concentration of 10-10-10 locally. That's not somewhere below the soil, for instance. Well, those gradients have to be disseminated somehow. And so gradients move from high concentration to low concentration. There's also voltage gradients and acidity gradients. This room, before anybody came in, it had a certain temperature and pressure and voltage and acidity and things. And then all of a sudden, 75 of us walk into this room. The room changes. All of those parameters are going to change. Well, a plant sitting in the soil, in the ground, has to deal with these gradients all the time, 24/7. And so this is another example of the life of a plant and the requirement for that plant to be able to deal with its environment. And it costs plant energy in order to do that. So I'm going to use the word gradient every now and then. And what I'd like you to recognize when I say that is a constantly changing environment. Okay? So let's talk about minerals for a minute. William Albrecht, anybody? A couple of you? When we start learning about plants and soil, we begin to learn that certain minerals are required in the soil. And when we talk about minerals, we think about calcium, NPK, nitrogen, calcium, potassium, phosphorus, right? Well, what about cobalt and molybdenum and selenium? What about silicon and boron and manganese? These are also minerals that the plants need to survive. Well, what we're going to talk about later when we talk about fermented plant juice is recognizing how to find these minerals. Well, so when we go back to the 10-10-10 that we put on our soil, do plants eat 10-10-10? No. Nobody eats 10-10-10. So what has to happen is the plant has to use energy to convert that into the cation and anion, the charged version of those minerals, right? It can't eat 10-10-10. It's got to eat something that's charged, an ion, a charged particle. This takes plant energy in order for it to do that. Okay? The other thing about these minerals is they have to be in the right proportions. We learned that calcium wants to be 68% of our soil, and that magnesium wants to be 12% of our soil. And we learned that things like cobalt wants to be 1 part per million of our soil. Right? So all of a sudden we realize that the soil's got to be something right in order for the plant to be able to get all these minerals that it needs to become healthy. The next thing about minerals, I missed one? The next thing about minerals or a soil test, how many people have done a soil test? A few of you, okay. When you do a soil test, if you do a soil test at a specific lab that is more in tune to soil tests than others, some of the parameters that you're going to get from that soil test are the exchange capacity. Anybody for here exchange capacity? No, exchange capacity. Well, we just talked about the fact that the plant needs to have minerals in certain forms. Ionic forms, charged forms. Well, the exchange capacity of your soil is the ability of that soil to hold on to charged particles. And if you have a soil with a high exchange capacity, then it has a tendency to want to hold on to those minerals and hang on to them. So that if you're growing squash, for instance, and all of a sudden around August, powdery mildew comes and starts taking advantage of your squash. That ever happen to anybody? Yeah? Okay. So the first question I'd ask is, did the powdery mildew just suddenly show up? Or did the plant health decline so that it became susceptible to the powdery mildew? And the answer is the latter. And so this is an example of maybe your soil not having a high enough exchange capacity. Your soil was not able to hold on to the minerals that the plant was converting into those ionic forms. And so in August, things get hot, there's not enough moisture, maybe the soil doesn't have these minerals available, so the health of the plant declines and becomes susceptible to the powdery mildew, becomes susceptible to the beetles that are eating it, becomes susceptible to the aphids that are eating it. Okay? The next thing on a soil test would be the electrical conductivity of the soil. How many people have actually seen a soil test with electrical conductivity on it? No, a couple of you? Okay. Now, why would anybody care about the electrical conductivity of soil, for heaven's sakes? The answer is because it's electric. We're all electric. The soil is electric. The plants are electric. The electrical conductivity is giving us information of how charge is flowing through our soil and our plant. How cool is that? So when we look at soil tests, one of the things that we see right off the bat is there are electric characteristics of our soil test that we need to understand. And this whole concept of electricity flowing through the soil, the concept of minerals being in ionic forms, charged forms, becomes the reality of the plant. And as I said before, it takes plant energy in order to create those charged ions. So to finish off the conversation about minerals, when I started looking into this thing, I thought, well, where the heck am I going to find cobalt? Where am I going to find molybdenum? Well, how do you pronounce molybdenum? Right? And the answer for me was when I started making fermented plant juices. These are the fermented plant juices. When I started making fermented plant juices, and I did the analysis of what was in them, on the top of this are the minerals that we just talked about. Chlorine, sulfur, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, boron, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, aluminum, cobalt, molybdenum, silicon, selenium, and nickel. And when I did the analysis of this, I found that they're all there. All of those minerals that I could barely pronounce, they were all there. And they're in plant proportions. So I suddenly realized, ding, that's why I eat that apple, because all the minerals are in it. And that's why I can make these very simple products and know that all of those trace minerals are in there. So I might not have to find cobalt at a store that came from who knows where, at what cost to human life, to the energy required to transport it from where it came from, the packaging that went into it. When you go to that box store and you buy that stuff on the shelf, there's a sustainability cost associated with that. It was the materials to make that were extracted from the soil somewhere. They were transported. There was energy to produce them. They were packaged and they were shipped. So the fact of you paying your money, as soon as you walked out of that store, you have incurred a sustainability cost. Well, all of a sudden I realized my word, here they are. I don't have to do that. And they're not toxic. These things they're made of plants. So the whole idea of minerals then is that we can get minerals from plants and we can use them in our growing environment. Okay, we good with minerals? Let's talk about biology, shall we? The one thing that if I was going to impress anything on you about biology, it's how much we don't know. There are millions of species of bacteria and fungi out there. Millions of them. We only know 10% of their names. How many people have heard of archaea? There's a reason. It's a new life form that we just identified in the 90s. It was first found in the geysers of Yellowstone Park in high temperature, high sulfur environments. It was also found at the bottom of the ocean, no light, high pressure environments. And then it was in 1997 timeframe, we suddenly realized, no, it's not a bacteria, it's a brand new life form. Can you imagine that 30 years ago, identifying a brand new life form? They have to go change all the life form, all the textbooks and things like that. They have to go change all that stuff, for heaven's sakes, right? That just shows you what we don't know. And not only do we only know the names of some of these things, we have no clue about their interactions, how these bacteria and fungi and archaea actually interact with each other. Now, what's really interesting about plants is the plants actually feed the soil biology. Plants are going to expend as much as 30% of the energy they make during photosynthesis to feed the soil biology. Now, in nature, when something takes 20-30% of something and gives it to something else, there's a darn good reason why. There's a darn good reason why. And the reason in this case is because the soil biology, the bacteria, fungi, and archaea, are the toolbox that the plant uses to control the environment in the soil. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that when we talk about voltage and acidity. So the plants feed the soil biology, which digests the organic matter on the soil, which increases the reach for nutrients and water for the plants. It actually is able to adjust the soil voltage and acidity, which we'll learn about in a minute. And it also makes it so that the flow of nutrients that come from the soil through the roots up into the plant is balanced. So most of us think, well, we water the plant, the water comes through the roots with minerals, everything's good. Well, the plant has to make sure that whatever's coming through that flow of water through the roots is nice, is balanced, is of the right voltage, of the right acidity, of the right concentration. So how does the plant do that? The way the plant does that is by feeding the biology in the soil such that the liquid, the soil solution, has all of the right constituencies it needs so that when it comes up through the xylem flow, through the roots into the plant, it doesn't cause toxicity and kill the plant. So the soil biology is the plant's digestive system. Not too different than us, right? We got all kind of biology going on in here. And heaven forbid we didn't, we wouldn't be able to digest food and have nutrients. It's the same for a plant. In fact, when Joan and I talk about stuff, we often talk about how similar the human body is to the plant soil system. There's a lot of similarities. Well, so listen, there we are again with the plant exuding all this energy into the soil in order to make things right, in order to make things balanced, in order to make the minerals in the right form. Again, it's plant energy that is controlling the soil and making the soil nice. And that's energy that it could use to grow leaves and increase photosynthesis efficiency. This is a really important point. There is no such thing as bad biology. Some of us think about the powdery mildew, for instance, or some of the other problems that you have on your plant. In many instances, the biology, the bacteria that's causing you a problem, it may exist in the soil and have very specific function in order to make sure that certain aspects of that system work. You might have the same bacteria on the leaf of a plant that's also performing specific function that's important. It's only when the bacteria becomes out of balance or in the wrong place is there a problem. An example in the human body might be E. coli. Everybody's heard of E. coli, right? It's popularized on the news. We hear it all the time. Oh my God, all the stuff, right? Well, guess what? All of us have E. coli in our guts. It's just balanced. Everything's cool. The system is chugging along and it's like, okay, E. coli, you do your thing over here. And everything's controlled so that it does what it does. It's only when that E. coli becomes in the wrong concentration, in the wrong place, that it becomes a problem. So it's very important to recognize that the bacteria, fungi, viruses, whatever it might be, that we have in our gardens or in our plants that we think are a problem, we recognize, no, they're not a problem. They serve incredibly important function. Maybe we don't understand what that function is. But the problem is they're out of balance. And we're going to talk about the voltage and the acidity in the system that causes this out of balance in a little bit. So when we have the biology in our system, this biology is very important in forming underground communication. Those mycelium and the fungi, they're sending signals all through the woods, all through the prairie in this part of the world. So when there is a pathogen or an insect that comes along, the entire ecosystem knows through this communication network. And the entire ecosystem is going to set up a response for that pest or that pathogen or whatever it is. It extends the reach for nutrients. If I'm a plant with a little noodle of a root, and this is the only surface area that I have to get water and nutrients, that's very limited. This biology extends that area tremendously, and we're going to see that in just a little bit when we learn about the microphagy cycle. The other thing about biology in the soil is it provides a function, a robustness in the system that is able to buffer the interventions that we might put forward. By having this biological function in our soil, the soil itself can handle some of the interventions that we're going to impose upon it to a certain degree. When we have soil that has lots of organic matter and lots of biological activity, it can withstand the insults that we might put forward to it far better than a soil that doesn't have any of that. And so we're building robustness into the system, the ability of the system to better cope and tolerate some of the problems that might be invoked on it. So this is the work of James White, and it starts off with the recognition that bacteria actually exists within the seed of a plant. You ever heard of that? That's just crazy, isn't it? Bacteria exist within the seeds. And it goes on to point out that this bacteria, this is a root. This is the work of James White, and I'm introducing to you the microphagy cycle. This is a root, and these are root hairs. And the bacteria is actually released through the root hairs into the soil. And this bacteria then goes into the soil, and it lives and thrives and builds up thick walls and all sorts of nutrition and things. And then that bacteria is reintroduced through the root tip and then is digested by the plant. The plant actually emits superoxide into that environment, digests the outer cell of the plant, of the bacteria, and then it is absorbed into the plant itself through the root. And then these bacteria, the ones that are able to survive, are reintroduced into the root hairs. And this is what actually causes the root hairs to elongate. Root hairs will not elongate without the bacteria being pushed through them. And so the root hairs get a little longer, and then the bacteria is now introduced into a different part of the soil to mine more nutrients and then become reabsorbed through the root tips. So plants are carnivores. They're actually digesting soil material with bacteria and then digesting the bacteria themselves. So now let's move on to organic matter. How many people think organic matter is important? There we go. There we go. So in this particular instance, I want to talk about the sources of organic matter. And the sources of organic matter, surprise, surprise, are a lot of plants. And there's this structural organic matter that lands on the top of the surface of a soil. And this is very important because it's this organic matter that's actually going to feed the bacteria on the top of the surface. And so if we have a field or a garden that has no litter on the top, then we are depriving the bacteria on the surface of the soil food. And so if we have a soil that has a tomato, a tomato, a tomato, and bare soil, we have eliminated the organic matter that's going to feed the top layer, the active layer of the bacteria, the biology on that system. The other forms of structural organic matter are the bacteria and fungi themselves, the actual material that's actually doing the chowing down, if you will, and their poop and dead bodies and all the things like that. These are very important sources of organic matter. Another form of organic matter is a liquid form of organic matter. These are the root exudates that we were talking about earlier. The actual liquids that are exuded from plant roots deep into the soil. This is the way you get organic matter deep into your soil. These are all very important. And the cartoon that I have here is depicting a gradient of organic matter. We need to have that top layer of structural organic matter on the top, but we need to have this gradient of organic matter going down deep into the soil. This is what's giving us all the water capability, the capability to hold on to water. It's giving us the hiding places for all of that bacteria to hide from protozoa, to hunt, for protozoa to hunt. We talked about the ionic forms of minerals. This is where it all happens, down in these aggregate structures. So we get down and down and down, and finally we get to this really fine, very small micron, 50, 60 micron size organic matter. And this is where things get really interesting. This is bacterial type size stuff. This is where life really starts happening. And what happens when we get into these situations, we get niche hotspots. We get places where there's large concentrations of bacteria or fungi. We get places where there's large concentrations of minerals. And this is where things really start to happen. If the soil was homogeneous, if the soil was constant, the same all the way through, what would happen? Nothing. Nothing. If it's all the same, if there's no gradient, if there's no change, if there's no difference, then nothing happens. There's no thing that drives things from A to B, like those gradients do. And so this whole idea of organic matter is extremely important in recognizing not only the need for a constant supply of organic matter, but the need for this gradient of organic matter. And this breaking down, this constant breaking down. And so we've got the structural leaves. So forgive me for being a New Englander and talking about woods. Because I don't know. You guys have any woods around here? I saw a tree on the way in. But nonetheless, even in a prairie, you're going to have the grasses on the top, right? And then as those grasses break down, you're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And you're going to establish this gradient of organic matter. Everything happens here. How many people are familiar with the different gas cyclings? The carbon cycles, the nitrogen cycles, the phosphorus cycles, the water cycles in the soil ecosystem. They do not happen unless this gradient of organic matter exists. The electrical conductivity that we talked about, right there. The conductivity, it's all right here. So it's really important to have this constant supply of organic matter. And so once we recognize we need this gradient of organic matter, what do you think happens to it when we till? We blow it up. And what do you think is going to bring that system back into balance? I'll give you one guess. Go ahead, you can say it. Plant energy. Plant energy. Plant energy. Right? Plant energy. There's nothing else. There's nothing else. Did I mention they've been doing it for 400 million years? So just a couple of facts about organic matter that just blew me out of the water. The first is that there's huge amounts of minerals in the soil. Huge, vast, vast quantities of minerals that we squander when we have some of the common practices that we do in the United States. The Dust Bowl, for instance. Think of all of the organic matter that was lost. Think of all the minerals that were lost. It's just incredible. And just for some fun facts, 2% organic matter is 2,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And as you increase the organic matter, you are increasing the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil. And the air is 78% nitrogen. Why am I adding nitrogen? Why am I adding nitrogen? Something to consider. The other thing is water and the ability of the soil to hold on to water. 2% organic matter can absorb an inch of rain per hour. All right? 4.5% organic matter, 5 inches of rain per hour. Well, I understand you guys don't get an awful lot of rain around here. But if I was in the business of trying to hold on to water, my first shot out of the can would be to increase the organic matter in my soil so that I could hold on to whatever rain did occur. Especially in the age that we live in, where weather patterns are changing, and there are many parts of the country that get 5-6 inches of rain per hour. That's not unheard of. We had 3 days of rain before we came here. And for those of you who walk barefoot, you can feel the wall, you can feel the soil change. Actually, with that much rain, you can wear cement shoes and you're going to feel the change. Because if you have good organic matter, that soil is going to become spongy. It's going to totally change. And you know, when you walk on your garden and it gets all spongy and soft and things like that, you're moving in the right direction. That's really good. So many human interventions disrupt the conditions, and they cause oxidation, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But when we leave the soil bare, all the water goes out, so we no longer have the water, and we're disrupting that soil ecosystem. When we use chemicals on our soil, we're also disrupting that system. We're killing the biology, we're drying things out, we're moving in the wrong direction. So, consider the plant energy when you do something. Consider the cost, the intervention cost of your actions. Well, I wanted to throw these couple slides in because I was in a quandary. When I first started gardening, one of the things that I recognized was I needed a compost pile. How many people have compost piles? All right, and we have compost piles because we think they're good. They've got organic matter, they've got biology in them, they've got all the stuff, right? That's a winner. Well, when I first started making compost piles, I recognized that my compost pile started this high, and in 2 years, it was this high. And I thought to myself, well, why is that? And how can I increase the amount of compost that was left? And so I started reading about it, and I started learning about this 25-to-1 ratio. 25 carbon to 1 part nitrogen is what I was led to believe that I needed in my compost pile, and I wondered, how come, why? And the answer is that when things mineralize, when the bacteria starts chowing down the carbon and nitrogen, it takes 8 parts carbon and 1 part nitrogen to feed the microbe, But in the process of doing so, 16 parts of those carbon go out into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. We're losing a tremendous amount of carbon into the air. And so it quickly became clear to me that managing my compost pile was really important to limit the amount that goes into the air. Okay, I got that. So now I know that I want to add leaves. They might have a 50-to-1 ratio, and maybe I want to add some wood chips, but they're going to have like a 200-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Maybe I don't want to add too many of those. And I really like that green grass and the manures. They're closer to 10-to-1 or something like that. Okay. Now, the next thing that came to my attention was speaking to farmers, real farmers, like the farmers you guys have around here. And they'd be talking to me about, well, Nigel, I'm trying to increase the organic matter in my soil, but I just can't get it to increase. And I said, well, geez, what are you doing? And he said, well, I add organic matter each year to my field, but it just doesn't increase. And this really got me to think about why. And so I started talking to some people about it, and there are a couple people, Harriet Mella, who is probably a name you don't recognize, who told me that she was looking at analysis of organic matter when it was fully broken down and found that the ratio of minerals in fully broken down soils was almost always the same. I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. And then I came across a gentleman by the name of David Johnson, who is co-creator of the Johnson-Su bioreactor. Anybody? Yeah, heard that one? And David Johnson was telling me that he does an awful lot of analysis on organic matter, on fully composted organic matter. And he said that he has a friend in New Zealand who uses all kinds of different things in his bioreactor, and yet the mineral proportions of the fully broken down compost in the compost made in New Zealand is the same as the mineral proportions of the compost made in New Mexico. So that was very interesting. And then I came across the work of Clive Kirkby. And this is some data that he came up with. Well, the first thing he did is he started looking at all of those composts, those fully broken down composts from all over the world, and recognizes that yes, indeed, there were proportions. And in fact, the proportions that were important were not just carbon and nitrogen, but carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And these are the ratios that he came up with. And then he started doing experiments with fields. And in this particular data set, we have 4 fields, and we have fields in black where it was just soil only. That's all they did. They did nothing but let the soil do its thing for the season. Another field, they added straw to the soil. And then in the third field, they added straw, but they measured the phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, carbon ratio of the straw and then added minerals to that to meet the ratio that the final composted organic matter had. And when we look at the results, we can see the fields where nothing was added, it lost organic matter, as we might expect. In the fields that only straw was added, some actually lost organic, the other ones gained some small amount. But in the fields where the proportions were met, organic matter was increased in all of them by a significant amount. So now when I build my compost pile, I make sure I've got phosphorus and sulfur added to that compost pile as well. So where do I get sulfur and phosphorus? Well, one of the forms of sulfur that I like is sheep's wool. Curly hair has lots of sulfur in it. Now, I don't know this to be true, but I'm led to believe that if one went into a beauty salon, it smells like eggs. No? Yes, I got a yes. Right? Now, the reason it might smell like eggs is because they're using sulfur to make the hair curly. And so if I want a source of sulfur, rather than go to the sulfur store, I might look for somebody that has sheep. and ask if I could use some of the sheep's wool in my compost pile. By the way, sheep's wool has a lot of other benefits to it and makes a great mulch. If I wanted a source of phosphorus, I might get some cow bones and crush them up and throw the cow bone into my compost pile for a source of sulfur. So the point here is that one of the reasons that many farmers are not able to increase the organic matter in their fields is because they're missing out on these ratios of elements when they build a compost pile. So here's a picture of my compost pile. This is what it looks like as it's building up, and this is what it looks like when it's sitting there for a year. And what do you notice about that compost pile? It's got plants growing on it. And why is that important? That's important because one of the attributes of a compost pile is the diverse biology within that compost pile. And one of the major forms of biological activity I want is the mycorrhizal fungi that have relationship with plants. Well, I can't get mycorrhizal fungi in a pile without the plants. And so by having plants grown on your compost pile, you can significantly increase the biological activity of that compost pile. And one final note, this is a peach tree that I grew from seed in this compost pile, and that peach tree is not quite a year old. I have a peach tree in another compost pile that is 2 years old. It is taller than I, and it has flowers on it. I'm going to get peaches out of my 2-year-old peach tree. This Q indicates a pause. Any questions? Yes?
The ratio that we had with the sulfur, is that going to be something that I can get from you?
The ratio? Yeah, the paper's referenced here. Right. And yes, I can give you the reference to the paper and make sure that, I'll give it to Jaden and make sure it's available to you. Yes? Yes?
The plants on your compost, did you plant all of those or do you let the weeds go on it too?
Great. I like to let the weeds that want to grow there grow. I'm a firm believer in, and you're going to hear me say this in a little bit, plants are our remediation program on Earth, and the weeds that want to grow there, they grow there for a very specific purpose. And we're going to learn more about that. But I also like to grow peach trees, for instance. If I wanted to start fruit trees, I'll just throw seeds into my compost pile. And they just explode. What's really fascinating about this, actually, and this is not the first time this happened, when I throw a bunch of seeds on my compost pile, there's one tree that just absolutely explodes. And all the other ones, they're only about a foot tall. So nature has decided that this guy's the guy. And off it goes. The other thing I like about a compost pile is planting potatoes, because it's nice and warm, and I'll get my first crop of new potatoes from my compost pile early, and we'll eat those early and enjoy them. So I look at the compost pile as an extension of my garden in growing, and I like to grow the stuff I like to eat. So I'd recommend you grow what you like, but I think also including the weeds that want to grow is an extremely important aspect of any system. Yes?
Can you hypothesize as to why the sulfur and those other minerals are depleted in compost? Is it maybe because microorganisms, and that's like the only source that they have of those minerals?
Yeah.
Depleted?
Let's see. Well, sulfur is a water-soluble anion, and so being water-soluble in my part of the world where I get a lot of rain, that sulfur is going to be washed out. I think that, and I don't know a lot about this, but I would suggest that the sulfur content of a lot of things that people put on the compost pile is lacking. For instance, if you put straw on your compost pile, that might have a good carbon content to it, probably not much nitrogen, and probably not much of the other minerals as well. Maybe some manures might have higher amounts of sulfur. I'm not really sure. But I think in general, what we generally put on our compost piles is deplete in things like phosphorus and sulfur.
Do you guys, I don't wanna say I guess the word not for, but I guess do you add some of your like fermented juices or extracts into your pile?
Indeed I do, and that's a really fun question because once some scientist tells me that, oh, the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur ratios matter, my mind goes, ding, everything matters. And so I water my compost piles with some of these homemade mineral amendments as well to make sure I get some molybdenum in there or some cobalt in there or whatever it might be. Yeah. Anything else?
How do you crush up the compost?
So it's a really fun question because I crush oyster shells as well. I find oyster shells to be a very good product. And what I did is first I like to eat oysters, so when I eat out and I order oysters, I ask for the shells to go. And of course that gets somebody's attention and they look at you funny. No judgment. But then it's like, okay, well, then somebody says, well, what are you doing this for, right? And I said, well, for my plants. And then all of a sudden, I happen to harvest mushrooms, so I bring the chef some mushrooms for some special dishes. And next thing you know, I'm in the back of the restaurant, and it's like, you take all these oyster shells, what do you do with them? Well, we throw them away naturally, right? I said, well, look, how about if you take a bucket and fill them up, and then I'll come here on Sunday, and I'll get your oyster. Fine. All of a sudden, I've got all the oyster shells I need, right? So the point is, to answer your question, is I went to the local welding shop and I found a tube and a plate and I asked the guy to weld the tube to the plate and I bring it home and I put them in there and I crush them. It's not that hard. Wear air protection. And the other thing I learned is I took an old pair of blue jeans and I put a little hole in it and doubled them up. And so I put the thing that I crush through the hole in the blue jeans so when I'm crushing it, all the dust stays in the container.
You still wear those blue jeans then?
Cat's out of the bag. Yes?
I was just wondering, couldn't you use bone meal?
You could use bone meal, but you'd have to buy bone meal. I don't buy anything. I don't want to buy anything. Well, so we get bone broth, and Joan makes bone broth in the wintertime and things like that, and when she's done with the bone broth, I get the bones, and I cook them, and that's what we'll talk about in the second part of the program. Yes?
Whenever you crush the bones, is that, I guess, post the vinegar extraction of them, or?
It could be, but I generally have dried bones in a container over here, and I'll use it for whichever purpose I need. But certainly after I've taken leached minerals with the vinegar extractions, then you could use it in that regard as well. Yes?
Is there evidence that new forms of voltage coming from things like satellites and telecommunication towers are changing soil?
That's a really fun question. So I happen to have a pretty good background in electromagnetic radiation. That's something that I studied when I was a kid. And the interaction of electromagnetic radiation from satellites, from towers and things like this is a fascinating study. If anybody's interested, I will also make a paper available to Jaden that's like thick with like 600 different references of scientific studies. And the easy answer is the interaction of electromagnetic radiation on life is extremely complex. I could go down a wicked rabbit hole, but we'd spend the rest of the night talking about it. The answer is that in some cases it can have extremely detrimental effects. In some cases it might even make things better to some degree, but it's a very specific frequency conversation. Very, very narrow band frequencies can have profound effects on a living organism. And so the easy answer is it very well may. One of the biggest problems is there's no real data. There's no large-scale study data. when 5G came on the scene, the Congress was actually interviewing the people that were putting forth the 5G idea, and it was Richard Blumenthal, a senator from Connecticut, that asked the question, is there any data to support the fact that 5G is safe? And the answer was no. So there is no data specifically on a very large-scale study that is in our hands and available to us to determine whether or not it's safe or not. Okay. I'm going to keep going. That wasn't that bad, was it? No? All right. It's getting better. Just bear with me here. Voltage. Okay. So now I want to talk about the electric characteristics of life. And first recognizing that all life is electric. And one of the studies that really caught my attention was this study by these folks. And what they're actually doing is using the resistance of an animal in order to determine its health. These people are actually measuring the resistance from an animal's tongue to ground and able to understand whether or not that animal is healthy or not. And you can see that whether it's a cow, a pig, a sheep, a turkey, or a chicken, they all have very specific voltages and resistance associated with them. That's me. Why do you laugh? It's a close proximity of. I actually measure the voltage from my tongue to ground for fun. And guess what? I have a voltage. You can take a multimeter and you can go put one end into the ground and put the other end on your tongue, and you can measure your resistance and you can measure your voltage. We are electric. Nope. Now, if you have shoes on, guess what the voltage is? 0, because you have insulated yourself from the ground. So this whole idea of grounded is real. We release negative ions through our body and into the soil by virtue of running around barefoot. I highly recommend you take off your shoes when you garden.
Also, it's going to make a difference if the grass is wet or not, too.
Exactly. Exactly. The other thing about this whole electric thing is that antennas are everywhere. You look at any plant, it's covered with hairs. We are covered with hairs. Have you ever heard the expression, the hair on the back of my neck? Well, first of all, you got to have hair on the back of your neck. Right? Otherwise, all bets are off. In fact, Native Americans that were hired by the United States government in the 1800s were often brought in to track and do all of the amazing things that Native people did because they lived outside. They didn't go inside. They experienced the world around them through all of their senses. And it was reported that some of these people actually lost some of these functions when they cut their hair, and when they shaved their necks, and when they had to wear the uniform, i.e., whatever it might have been. Antennae are on plants. When you see an ant, see those antennas swinging around? What's going on there is when those antennas move apart, it increases the frequency range that the insect can detect. And then when those antennae go together, it's determining the direction where that frequency is coming from. We're going to learn in a little bit that unhealthy plants actually emit electromagnetic radiation in the infrared spectrum. That's just below the visible spectrum. And insects zero in on it. So those aphids and the beetles that are eating your plants in your garden, they're eating them because the plant is saying, yo, eat here. I'm unhealthy. In fact, I can tell you the health of your plant by the insect that's eating it. Tom Dykstra's work. If you have aphids eating your plant, then you have plant that have a percent sucrose of about 7%. That's a pretty unhealthy plant, 7% or less. If you have beetles eating your plants, you've got a refractive index of percent sucrose in your plant of about 12 or 10%. Now the good news is you don't have aphid problems anymore. But the point is that the plants are signaling to the world their health. And this is why insects are coming and eating your plants. Because the plant is telling the world that it's not healthy. A bee will not go near a plant that has a percent sucrose sugar content of that plant less than 6. It won't even bother with the plant. The bee knows. It senses it from the electromagnetic radiation coming from the bee. Which always makes me wonder when I go to a nursery and there are these rows of plants, these beautiful flowering plants. There's no insects. What's up with that? Electricity is everywhere. So these are the labels that we put on plants. We say plants have flowers and leaves and roots. There's a whole nother language I'd like you to think about. The next time you look at your plant, think about it being a power plant. Thinking about having antenna and solar panels and current. And in the soil, it's a battery. All of that energy is flowing into the soil, into that organic matter, creating a battery. And that battery has electrical characteristics. It has electrical conductivity. All right? The plant is electric. Okay, this is where things get a little thick and deep. Olivier Husson has actually measured the voltage and acidity of different parts of a plant. And in this study, he's actually measured the voltage and the acidity of the various leaves on a plant. And I've tabularized these little tiny numbers because nobody in their right mind can read them. And what we see here is that the pH of the plant, as I go from the top leaf down to the bottom leaf, decreases, 6, 5. And the voltage of the leaf from the top down decreases. It becomes more negative. And so we can see that plants have gradients of voltage and acidity. In fact, the most negative part of a plant is the chloroplast at minus 400. These are different parts of a plant. The xylem and the phloem, those are the sap flows of the plant. And the apoplast, cytoplast, chloroplast, and mitochondria, these are all parts of the cells, actually cellular structures of a plant. Intercellular structures, extracellular, and the chloroplast that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where photosynthesis is happening. And that's the most negative part of a plant. And this current flows through the plant into the roots and charges the battery in the soil, that organic matter that's so important in the soil. Right? How cool is that? What is it with you?
How many people understood that?
Okay, fair enough. How many people understood that? All right, 2.5, all right. The important thing is not necessarily to understand it, but recognize that the model of the plant that you may have had may need some refining. Let's take it a step further.
So in other words, when the soil is better health, you have better power current in the soil.
That is exactly correct. See? So check this out. This is the culmination of decades of work. This is voltage on the Y scale, acidity on the bottom scale, and these are areas of living things. This is where healthy plants want to be. This is where viruses are, bacteria, insects, and fungi. And what Olivier has actually shown is that fungi exist in very specific voltage and acidity environments. Bacteria exist in very specific voltage and acidity environments. And a healthy plant exists in a very specific voltage and acidity environment. And the energy that the plant gets during photosynthesis is what enables the plant to control that voltage and that acidity. And when the plant becomes unhealthy and can no longer control those environments and things move up and to the right, that is when you get fungi, bacteria, insect pressure. And he's been able to show that it's when those conditions move into those ranges that the fungi actually take hold, or the bacteria take hold, or the insect take hold. Now, the bacteria, fungi, and insects all have the ability to control this environment as well. And so what we see is life is a battle to control the voltage and the acidity. This is what's going on in your gut. This is what's going on everywhere in life. So the next thing is to recognize that when we do things to our soils, we are affecting this voltage and acidity. And oxidation is moving us up and to the right. And so when we till our fields, we are exposing the soil to oxygen, which causes a reaction that moves the voltage and the acidity up and to the right, which makes conditions ripe for these pathogens and insect pressure. And if the plant doesn't have the energy to keep things down in this range where it wants to be, then it gets sick. Things get out of balance. And that's when we have insect pressure and pathogen pressure. And the things that keep us down in this range are photosynthesis. We could talk about photosynthesis efficiency now. How do you increase the photosynthesis efficiency of your plant? Most plants have a photosynthesis efficiency of about 20 or 30%. If we could simply double the photosynthesis efficiency up into the 50 and 60% range, we double the energy that the plant has in order to keep it in this nice range. So the important thing is not to say, look at this curve, how do I understand this? The important thing is to recognize is that our interventions are moving the voltage and the acidity up into a range that makes the plant susceptible to the fungi, bacteria, viruses, and insects that might want to eat it. And furthermore, the plant is advertising to those pathogens, come and eat here. Because if we didn't have these insects and pathogens to chow down the plant, we'd be in a world of garbage. Because there'd be nothing to eat all the unhealthy plants that are around. Okay? This is a fine point, but I think it's well worth mentioning. This is voltage again. By the way, it's called redox potential for anybody that really wants to know, but I use the word voltage because it's a lot easier. And this is water. Wilting point, field capacity, saturation, submersion. And this dark line represents the voltage of a system with high biological activity. If you don't have high biological activity in your soil, then you are on this curve, which shows that as the water content of your soil changes, the voltage might change by 200 millivolts. Well, if we look at this curve, 200 millivolts puts us right into the range of I don't want to be there. And so the mere fact that you don't have biological activity in your soil is causing the environment that you're growing your plant in to be highly susceptible to huge swings in voltage in your soil. So, you say to yourself, this guy's nuts, man. What is he telling me? What I'm telling you is you need the biological activity in your soil. What I'm telling you is you need that organic matter in your soil in order to make the plant not have to expend its energy to control that environment to keep you out of here. So, plants expend energy to adjust the voltage and acidity in their soil. They do it to control pathogens, to make sure that the xylem flow is nice, to selectively promote biological activity, the toolbox that the plant uses. If you want more information, I've written a whole bunch of articles on Acres USA, and they're on my website. I don't know what my website is. It's Nigel Palmer or something like that. But anyway, there's an article section, and there's a whole bunch of articles in there. If you like what you're hearing, they're worth reading. So the important thing of this chart is to not so much understand it specifically, but recognize that your actions, your interventions in the garden are going to move you on this curve. And things like tilling, adding chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, all of those things are moving us up into the direction that's going to support bacterial, fungi, viruses, and insect. And the only thing available to move the system back down is the plant energy and the use of photosynthesis, which the plant could otherwise use to grow healthy fruits and vegetables that we want to eat. Anybody familiar with that curve? Anybody familiar with this? This is what's classically used in gardening programs to tell you what minerals are available based on a specific soil pH. Right? And so if we look at this, we say, well, as long as I've got a pH of 6, 6.5, everything's kind of cool, right? Now we know better. Now we know that there's another leg to the conversation. We know that there's this voltage thing sitting out there. Introducing Porbay diagrams. Porbay diagrams came around in the 50s, and Porbay diagrams are giving us information about the different forms of a particular mineral and where they become available to a plant. This is a Porbay diagram for manganese, voltage and acidity, and this shaded area is the Mn, the magnesium 2+ ion that plants can use. Now you know what I just said, don't you? No. Well, it's true. The point is that, remember we said that the plant has to have the minerals in the right form in order for them to use them. This is that form. And here we have a balanced soil. And so if you have a balanced soil, then you can see that that form of manganese is available to the plant. If I have that oxidized soil up into this range, then that manganese is no longer available to the plant. The plant can't get it. And the only way for the plant to get that manganese is by exerting energy to move the voltage and the acidity down in this range to make that availability of manganese possible. And so we can again use this chart as a way to measure or quantify the amount of energy that the plant has to use in order to make those minerals available. So perhaps you've heard that, well, just because there's magnesium or manganese or iron or whatever it is in the soil doesn't mean it's available to the plant, right? This is what we're talking about. And what we're suggesting here is that it requires plant energy to move the system into a place where those minerals become available. 1950s, by the way, right? This is where foliar sprays become so important. Because if I have a system that is such that these minerals are not available in the soil, even though they're in the soil, because they're not in the right forms and the plant doesn't have the energy to convert them into that form, this is when foliar sprays become important. How many people know what a foliar spray is? Okay, a few of you. Very good. So a foliar spray is nothing more than spraying a mist onto the leaves of the plant. There are two ways you can feed a plant. You can feed a plant by watering it, often called drenching. And what that does is that puts that liquid into the soil, and then it's absorbed through the roots. Well, now when I water something, a lot of that water is going to go off on the surface, go down into the soil to who knows where, and only a small proportion is actually going to go up through the roots. But when I feed the plant with a foliar spray and I'm putting that liquid right on the leaf of the plant, several really cool things happen. The first is that I'm extremely efficient in the feeding of that plant, because rather than dumping a half a gallon that goes into the soil, I'm putting a very small amount of a mist on the leaf. But the second thing is I'm feeding the plant through the phloem flow, which not only feeds all the different sinks in the plant, but it's also going to feed the biology in the soil through the root exudates. Remember we said that the plant uses 30% of its sugars to feed the soil biology through the root exudates that come out of the plant. So when I'm feeding my plant with a foliar spray on the surface of its leaves, I'm also feeding the soil biology as well. How cool is that? Pore bay diagrams. Here's one for iron, but I think you've had enough of pore bay diagrams. So are there any questions? Yes. Any questions? Too much? No? Okay. Yes.
Talk about like soil particle size in relation to the minerals and availability.
Soil particle size. So that goes back to...
You're saying, we have different mixes of soil types.
Okay.
Does that play into that?
Yeah, so that goes back to the conversation about aggregate structures. And you remember we were talking about the organic matter and this gradient of organic matter that started off with the large structural things on the bottom, and then it got smaller and smaller and smaller, and we got down to that little square that we called aggregate structure. And that's where we were in the 30, 40 micron, 10 to the minus 6 meters, really, really small. And so those are really important in holding on to the cations, in making the small spaces that the bacteria can hide in, where the protozoa hunt, where water can actually be stored and things like that. When we talk about particle size, sand, clay, and silts, we're really just talking about size, right? All that is a number. A clay might be 0.000008, right? I'm not quite sure if I'm answering your question, but the point is that is very important. And when we get down into those very, very small numbers, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where all of this stuff is really happening relative to these ions that we're talking about and these small particles and the holding on to charge and all of this stuff. It's down in those very, very small numbers. Anybody else? Yeah.
So you talked about the no-till and disturbing the compost layer. How do I go about planting my tomatoes without disturbing them?
That's a really, really good question. Maybe we can have another conversation about that. In fact, when I first started doing this, I'd go and weed my garden. I live in glacial moraine, really compact, hard stuff, right? So I'd go and pick the weeds out of my garden when I started, and I'd go, snap, snap, arr, snap, right? After a while of making sure that there was organic matter on the surface for a couple of years, all of a sudden, I pull that quackgrass off, or those stinging nettles, and the root structure just comes right up. Everything changes. And the problem is that most of us are used to tomato, tomato, tomato with nothing but soil, and so it's hard as a rock. It doesn't have these aggregate structures and things that we're talking about. So if you make sure you have a cover crop on your soil, if you make sure that in the wintertime you put 2, 3, 4 inches of leaves, crushed leaves on your surface, all of a sudden you're bringing that soil to life. You're creating the environment where that biology will survive. You're creating the environment where there are these pore structures, where there is gas exchange, where there is moisture and all these things happening. And then all of a sudden you're going to realize all you got to do is move it aside and plant your tomatoes. And so it's an evolutionary process. And it's not, for a home gardener, it's pretty easy. If I do something and I only get 6 instead of 12 tomatoes, so what? Where things really get difficult is when you're a farmer and you're relying on the farm bill. And the government's saying you ought to plant this. And we're going to guarantee you that. And if you fail, we're going to give you insurance. And if you go and try what this guy's talking about, you're on your own. That's where things get difficult. That's when you find the metal that exists in your heart. Anybody else? Okay. I got one more for you, and then we're going to go on to, I'm going to take a break, okay? And this is the work of, what was this one? Oh, that was nitrogen. This is the work of Gerald Pollack in the 4th phase of water. And I need to drink something, excuse me. So Gerald Pollack has done an awful lot of work with water. And what he has found is that when water is exposed to infrared radiation, then a certain structure is formed. Infrared radiation is nothing more than heat. That's how we experience infrared radiation. It's just like visible light, except it's below the visible spectrum. We can't see it, but we experience it as heat. And so in this cartoon, I have a bucket, and I'm going to be looking at the wall of the bucket and the water that's inside that bucket. And what happens is that a structure actually occurs on the wall of the bucket, and it's a crystalline structure similar to ice, but it's not ice. It's actually charged, and it relieves from the water a positive ion, a hydrogen ion, which is a proton, which, let's just call it a charged particle. And so what happens in this process is a structure actually forms on the wall of the bucket. And the way I like to explain this is the concept of jacking cider. Does anybody know what I just said? No. Yes. If I'm out in a rural area and I want to make some high-end hooch, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get some apples and I'm going to ferment them. And I'm going to get some alcohol going on in there, kind of like a winey kind of thing. But that's not what I want. I want some hooch. So what do? I freeze it. And so when you take this bucket of water alcohol mix and you freeze it, the ice forms a crystalline structure. And crystalline structures are all tight and crystal-like. And they push out all of the contaminants. In this case, the alcohol. So I leave it out overnight, it freezes, I take the ice, and I just increase the alcohol content of my bucket of cider. This is called jacking cider. This is what's going on here. I'm creating a crystalline structure that is pushing out all of the contaminants into the middle of the bucket. All right? So one day, Gerald Pollack was doing this experiment with tubes, and they happened to leave the tube in the solution with a light on it, and the dude doing the experiment forgot to turn the light off and came in the next morning and found that there was a constant flow of the contaminant and these hydrogen charges coming out of the middle of the tube, and that there has formed this negative structure on the inside diameter of the tube. Okay? Now, if I considered a redwood tree or a human body with arteries and veins, which are nothing more than tubes, what happens is, when exposed to infrared radiation, let's use that redwood tree that's 100 feet, 150 feet tall, how the heck does nutrient get up to the top of the redwood tree? The answer is, it's suggested that there is this negative structure that occurs on the inside diameter of the xylem flow, and the contaminants, the nutrients, and the bacteria that we've learned are in the flow are actually driven to the top by charge. And now, all of a sudden, I can see the electrical path in a plant. This is the wire. One of the things I always wonder is, okay, the plant's electric. Oh, that's great, Nigel. I have no idea what you're telling me, but okay, it's electric. Forget about it. The next thing I thought of is, well, how the heck does the charge flow through the plant? How does charge flow through a plant? Where's the wire? Right? Here's the wire. Here's the wire. In the human body, red blood cells flow through the human body. Red blood cells are pretty big. They're on the order of 6 or 7 microns in diameter. And yet they go through our capillaries that are 3 to 5 microns in diameter, much smaller. The proverbial 10 pounds through a 1 pound, right? There's no pressure drop across a capillary. How does that happen? If you do the physics and figure out how much pressure it takes to pump blood through the human body, the heart does not have the capacity to do it. How does that happen? When somebody's heart stops and the guy drops to the ground, right? Start pounding on the chest. So what are we doing when we're pounding on the chest? What we're doing is we're moving the lungs so that air gets into the lungs. And yet the blood still flows through the body to distribute that air when the heart is not pumping. How does that happen? It is suggested that it is the fourth phase of water and this electrical circuitry that is moving things along. This is why a hot bath feels so darn good. That is the infrared radiation that's creating this fourth phase of water that's moving blood and stuff through your body. This is why a sauna feels so good. This is why sitting in the sun feels so good. So I have a cartoon, an image that I want to show you. And this is a video. I think it's from University of Wisconsin, actually. And what we're going to see is a glutamate-induced calcium signal propagate through a plant. This is a plant, and there's a glutamate insult that's going to be occurring here, and we're going to watch the calcium flow through this plant. You guys ready? All right, let's see what happens. How does that happen? going to see it again. Here it comes. And then it subsides. This is plant energy. This is the movement of ionic compounds within plants. So actually, this is it's a 300 seconds, and it's speeded up. So it's actually 300 seconds. What's that? A few minutes or something like that. 5 minutes? Okay, thank you. Okay. Happens in the human body too. Thank you. All right. The last thing I wanted to talk about relative to this is the whole idea of structured water. Anybody heard of structured water? 0. 1 person on structured water. Structured water is a really interesting phenomena, and I won't go into its nuances, but I will say that when I mix up these mineral amendments, one of the things that I want to do is add energy to the amendment before I apply it. My main impetus when I started this was to provide a surfactant effect. Surfactant, this is where you know how water beads up on things? And some people add things like dish soap or something like that to cause it to spread out on the leaf rather than have it bead up. That's a surfactant effect. And I've read papers that suggest that by stirring the water, by spinning the water, you get this surfactant effect. So I'm doing this originally to add energy to the water as well as to make the water spread out on the leaf. So when I spray it with my foliar spray, because I realize that's a far more effective way to feed plants, that I'm also making sure that that liquid is spread out on the leaf and that I want to add energy to it. We could talk about intent and all kinds of really fun energy thing, but we'd be taking a sharp right. When I read Gerald Pollack's book, one of the things that he said, well, let me ask you, if I'm spinning a bucket of water, what do you think happens to the temperature of the water? How many people think it goes up? Couple. How many people think it goes down? Couple. How many people couldn't care less? Fair question. The fact of the matter is, Gerald Pollack says the temperature goes down, which blew my mind. How could I be adding energy to the system and the temperature go down? Well, first of all, I thought, well, how could some world-renowned physicist who's been studying this thing for 40 years, how could he possibly be right? Fair question, right? So I took a couple of buckets of water and I left them in my basement overnight. Nice and steady, constant temperature, nothing's changing. And I started spinning it and I got the temperature to go down. It went down. Why? Then comes Gerald Pollack with the fourth phase of water. The molecules in that bucket of water, when it was just sitting there, are random. They're going all over the place. Bing, gada bang, gada bang. When I stir it and I create this fourth phase of water, it's a structure. It's in that crystal structure. So the molecules that are on that crystal structure, they're not doing this anymore. They're doing this. And so the net energy in the bucket of water, the temperature of the water goes down because the energy is put into making the structure. And so now I have a way of measuring the structure of my water by measuring how much the temperature goes down when I spin it. Who cares? Maybe I should have left that part out. All right. Are there any questions? I will say thank you for tolerating me. And I hope that if nothing else, that this gave you an entirely different perspective on what's going on in your garden.